It is now 1 hour before my debate. I am going to talk as fast as I possibly can to go through this material so that I can finally do some final cuts. And this is the third version of my opening. So I'm very confident in this debate because of divine appointment. You see, I know a guy that's in this Discord server, Los Homies, that knows about viticulture. And I asked, and he's Catholic, or he's actually Orthodox. And I went in there to talk to him, and there was more than one person in there that knew about viticulture. And so I ran all of this by him. So number one, I'm basically saying in one sense, this message concerning viticulture is Orthodox and horticulturally approved. Now, the other thing is I'm thankful for debating Dan Chapa because there's other people like Sam Shamoon who don't do formal debates in every situation, and those people I spar with. And so that if he will not formally debate, that's what I'll do. I'll go on his show. So what I'm going to be doing in this debate is I'm going to give him my view of John 15, arguing for it's the best exegesis. So we need to talk about why we're debating about John 15, what is the best exegesis of John 15, and what does this passage have to say about perseverance and apostasy, because that's the main issue with Dan Chapa, why he rejects free grace. So why is this passage not compatible with free grace theology? What are informing the decisions about the interpretation of the passage? In other words, why is free grace theology wrong based on this passage? Now, I'm going to do something unique. I'm going to talk about words that are not in John 15. And the reason I'm going to talk about these words not being in there, because a lot of times in these conversations, people put them in there. Now, one of the words is destroy, which can just mean ruin, and context determines what's being mentioned by this. In fact, Chris Morrison made a reference to this, So here's what's interesting. This word does occur in verb form in Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah, where you're talking about temporal fire, physical death, and the ruin is about the destruction of the city. Doesn't mean that the city never exists in that way. It means it's not functioning no longer the way that it was functioning before. Something has changed. Now, also, Sodom and Gomorrah is the first time that the word salvation, sozo, is used in the Septuagint. And so this is significant. I'm not talking about a law of first mention or anything, but if you're going to build your concept of understanding salvation, at least from the word, for the Septuagint, this would be a good place to understand in light of this. Now, there is a word that actually is in the text, and it's kaio, the word for burn in here, but it never mentions the lake of fire and all of those issues, so we have to unpack what that is. Now, my thesis for this debate, now that I've talked about these words that are not here and the word that is here, my thesis for this debate, both specific and general being free grace theology, is that in John 2, many of the disciples believe. Many people believe, but Jesus didn't entrust himself in there. So what you have going on in the Gospel of John is you have Jesus narrowing down who his 12 will be, even though one of them is going to betray. Okay, so we see that in John 6. We see that in John 13. He who has been bathed need only to have his feet washed. Traditionally, most people would take bathed as a positional idea referring to salvation, and foot washing related to sanctification. Now, when we keep going on in John 15:3, so you're already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. All right. So I believe that this is talking about commission of the apostles, that these are promises given to the apostles. In John 15, it says, you did not choose me, but I chose you. And so this is related to being chosen an apostleship. And yes, guess what? Judas was chosen for apostleship. This is not a chosen for salvation. This is a chosen for service, and Judas was replaced in terms of that. What's interesting is how John 15 ends, what I think it links together with the whole purpose for divine imagery, and we'll go into the structure later on of John 15. It's talking about the helper that comes, the spirit of truth, and that will allow them to show that he's a testify of what known from the beginning, because previously he talks about, I call you friends because you know what I'm doing. In other words, he's given them special revelation. This is the promise given to the apostles to receive revelation for building of the church. Now, to understand why we're debating this issue in the first place is to understand the previous debates that we had. I debated Church of Fan on perseverance. I focused on Hebrews. He focused on First John. That's why Dan Chapa came back and we did the Hebrews warning passage. Then we did the 2v2, me and Eli versus Dan Chapa and Church and Fan. And those other issues came up, including First John. Now, in the midst of that, I had some debates on James, but then Church and Fan and Chapa debated for First John. And so in the midst of that First John debate, we saw that John 15 was influenced a lot of the interpretations of First John. So that's why we're debating this. Now, when we're talking about the topic of exegesis, here are some diagrams to remind us that exegesis is more complex than a lot of people mention. If anyone wants to test my method, go ahead. And here's my chart where I'm showing you how biblical theology and exegesis and systematic theology relate to each other. Here's a reminder of what is included within an exegetical idea. I know I ain't got time to go through these, but there's various gaps in interpretation. I made this chart to explain this. And so I'm going to be focusing on the cultural gap and the literary gap, and then secondarily, the language gap. So essentially what I'm talking about here is that in John 15, I have not been challenged by John 15 in many years. In 2004, my dad died. And after that, I read Secrets of the Vine by Wilkerson, and it explained to me about viticulture. In 2005, I actually took horticulture and learned more about that. In 2008, whenever I was learning the intermediate Greek, I was using Mounce's Greater Reader, which is second thing in there is on John 15, which he's got a series that I also reviewed before I began this debate. In 2009, I became explicitly free grace. In 2010, I was looking at journal articles concerning John 15. In 2017 at GS conference, Gary Derrickson spoke on viticulture, and he talked about a season distinction. In other words, the lifting up or the taking away occurs in the beginning of the season, and then the burning that occurs later on is in the later season. And this may be the key to unlocking John chapter 15, and we'll talk about. In 2018, I taught Bible study methods using John 15, and Church of Fan and Chapa reviewed it, which is interesting because they saw how I taught in my church in a non-antinomian way, because we know that's the accusation that most people throw at free grace. 2 years ago, SFT and I did a thing on John 15, and then it opened up to a panel discussion. 1 year ago, we did John 15 again, and we did a panel discussion. Shortly after that, Crawford and Mary debated that, and I did the after show discussion about that. So needless to say, we've been in John 15 a whole lot. Now, my approach, typically whenever I'm preparing for a debate, whenever I'm consulting other materials, is I go to bestcommentaries.com after going to Constable's Notes, and then I go from recent to Otis. Not saying that that's the right way, but that's my approach. And so here's some various journal articles that I went into that support the ideas about commissioning and appointment of the apostles, the purpose statements, the structure, more of the viticulture stuff, and then I, of course, read the updated version of Dillo's Final Destiny. Now, in the midst of studying all this, I came across a guy named Karagonis. And Karagonis made a unique contribution that I found also mentioned in the Baylor Handbook that basically argues that rather than vine, this should be translated as vineyard. And we could talk about the implications of that. Now, what you can see here from this chiastic structure that's in one of the journal articles is that the focus is on the vines and the community of mutual love, just like Chris Morrison was arguing with Church and Fan. And you see also in this context, you have the choosing of the apostles, the promise of the Holy Spirit, the promise of revelation and guiding of what would be the future church. And so that's the structure we can talk about. Furthermore, in this farewell discourse, there are 6 times that the phrase, these things which I've spoken to you, are occurring on. And based on what this journal says is 15:111 is the idea of joy. So you see the intersection there with First John. Here's the other section with that. So here are some things to be thinking about. What does it mean to abide and all of those issues like that? But you have a division of the relationship of Christ, 1 through 11, relationship with other believers, 12 through 17, and relationship with the world, 15 through 16. Now, I already mentioned all of that. as I'm talking about this motif of vines that is within the Bible, understand that what I'm basically saying is that the idea is to be useful or be chastised. In other words, God wants a person to be faithful and fruitful. We see this with the prologue to the Pentateuch, which is Genesis, both pre-fall and post-fall in the garden. In Deuteronomy 28 and 30, talking about the blessings and the curses, the divine discipline there, the negative and positive imagery that's used throughout the vine stuff. In particular, Ezekiel 15 was talking on a national level about the usefulness, faithfulness and unfaithfulness that is mentioned there. And then we come to John 15, which is primarily about the apostles, but has secondary application for the church because it's written underneath during the time underneath the law, but it's written during the church age. And then we have the kingdom fulfillment of divine restoration. And then also we have Hebrews 6, which we could put in there as well. Now, in previous debates, I've talked about how the Septuagint uses the same words as Hebrews 6, where it's talking about thorns and thistles and burning and all of that. During that time, I made this chart that shows the connection between Deuteronomy 28, blessing and cursing, and how it's manifested in Hebrews 6. And I got the green and the blue are good, and the brown and the red are bad. But basically what you're having here is this idea of a burning for cursing or divine discipline, which I believe is a metonymy. Now, going into more detail, we could talk a little bit more about this vineyard imagery. Now, what's interesting is that MacArthur, whenever he was talking about John 15 in the gospel according to Jesus, he uses James 2 to interpret that. And I don't think that's a wrong approach. James was the first book of the New Testament being written, but the issue is MacArthur misinterprets James 2. And I think what's going on in this debate is that there's a misinterpretation of James 2, which is informing their understanding of John chapter 15. We could look at other passages like Romans 11, where it talks about this imagery, and it also relates to faithfulness of service. Same thing with Hebrews 6, and then also going throughout there. Now, what's so interesting is that when you go look at Pliny, who wrote during the 1st century about horticulture, a resource that I was introduced to before I ever started learning Greek or any of this stuff, was in horticulture class, talks about right here that the vines can be useless. Now, Dan Chapa has mentioned in his debate prep that there's no way, because Jesus is not useless. So the useless idea doesn't make sense. Yet we see useless as being used here by Pliny. It's used in Ezekiel 15, and I believe that's the primary idea, and that's how it intersects with James 2, because that deals with uselessness as well. So here's the MacArthur quote. Now, when I'm developing my biblical theology, my Old Testament theology, I see God divine disciplining them as a perfect parent. And he talks about life and death in Deuteronomy, which is basically the life and curse. So in other words, this is a metonymy. So when we see ideas like life and death, we need to flip it back to the blessing and cursing idea and see actually what's involved in the passage. How is it a warning? How is it encouragement? And how is it feeding into divine imagery? Now, here's my chart where I'm running things through. Chapa believes that Judas is unsaved. He probably believes that John 13 is positional bathing, and John the foot washing is experiential, and abiding and perseverance are experiential. Now, theologically, I agree Judas is unsaved. I don't know if I could prove that, but positionally, theologically, we are in Christ abiding. I don't know if the term abiding is used positionally, but that is an option I could consider. Now, experientially, I believe that it's abiding, but the thing that I'm adding, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this, is I think bathing refers to being introduced into a new role, a ministry that the apostles were mentioned. Now, none of this is new because a lot of this stuff I've already brought up in my stuff from teaching in John 15 that Dan and Turchafan dealt with, okay? So I view that as all about sanctification. And then concerning the ultimate category, the fire is not the focus of this allegory, all right? And it's not saying anything about here but the lake of fire necessarily. Okay, so I got a couple slides here. There's Pliny, natural history. This is typically the way people understand the abide and lift up, take away, but the real issue is 6. We don't have to focus on verse 2. And there's other issues we could talk about, like the puns involved in the passages and all of this. But this is what I want to read here. It says basically what he's talking about here is that there's a difference between a spring training of lifting up the branch or the vine to cleanse it for photosynthesis, to prune it, and to promote all of that. And wood is not produced until later on. So in 2, it's a different season, whereas in the part where it's in verse 6, it's talking about the wood that's already produced being burned up. And what's so interesting about this, it takes 5 years to train a vine. For the first 3 years, it doesn't bear fruit. And I ran all this by the viticulture guys in Las Homies. All right, so my point is that I don't believe 6 is explaining 2, and I don't believe that 6 is referring to hell. It's just describing the normal process of the what's left over after a vine is useless. You can't build nothing out of it, so you burn it. That was the point of Ezekiel 15. You know, there's a discussion about the indefinite pronoun tis. I'm going to try to get to it in time, but I only got a few minutes before that's going to occur, and I got some other notes here. And then I also have walking through the creative reader stuff about the Greek that needs to come up. You know, I focus more attention on the culture and the background and all this, but I don't want anyone to accuse me of not doing exegesis. I have gone through the Greek. I am doing these things. I just finished a free grace versus lordship class, and I'm thankful for this opportunity. And hopefully, well, it's 6:17 right now. The debate's at 7 p.m. So I'll end this, upload this, and just give my opponent as much advantage as possible so that we can get to clarification on these issues and dig down deeper in the debate and cross-exam. God bless.